Good evening, traveller. Wherever you are, perhaps lying in bed with the world dimmed around you, let this voice be your lantern. Tonight, we drift into a city older than sleep itself, where cobblestones remember both hymns and sighs. If you find comfort in stories that wander through shadows, you might wish to rest your mind here a little longer. And if you enjoy these late-night journeys, a quiet gesture, a like, a subscribe, keeps the stories breathing. But a small warning, the tale you're about to hear is not meant to shock. It may, however, stir a kind of gentle unease, the way an old bell rings faintly in fog. Imagine this, a medieval city wrapped in the scent of rain and smoke. Church towers pierce the night sky, their bells tolling curfew. Candles flicker behind stained glass as prayers rise with the incense. Only a few streets away, another kind of light burns, a softer, more human glow. Windows half shuttered, laughter muffled, music drifting like perfume through the alleys. Here, morality and survival live door to door. The same guards who kneel before the altar in daylight patrol the red lanes at dusk, pretending not to see too much. And the same men who listen to the priest's warnings about sin find themselves, hours later, whispering confessions of another kind in rented rooms. This world was not hidden, it was organized. Brothels stood openly in designated quarters, the Bishop's Alley, the Lantern Quarter, the Street of Mercy. Irony was the mortar of medieval life. Cities like Paris, London, and Venice all shared the same paradox. In the shadow of cathedrals, houses of desire operated legally. They were taxed, inspected, even protected by law. How could such contradiction survive? How could a society that feared damnation still draw maps for sin? The answer, as it often does in human history, lies not in purity, but in control. The medieval mind lived in a cage built from faith and necessity. Sin, they believed, was inevitable. The task was not to erase it, but to contain it. Like building dams against a flood, the church allowed prostitution as a lesser evil, a way to protect honorable women from men's unchecked lust. The logic was grim but practical. If vice must exist, better to know where it sleeps. So, the city planned its darkness carefully. Brothels were placed near the gates, away from marketplaces and noble houses, yet close enough for merchants and soldiers. Women were required to wear coloured veils or striped dresses, marking them as both visible and invisible. They could walk the streets, but not during feast days. They could speak to men, but not to priests. Their lives were ruled by paradox, like candles that burned only when shadow permitted. And so, as night deepened, the city transformed. Where monks whispered prayers in cloisters, music rose in taverns. The rhythm of drums, the clinking of coins, the low murmur of agreements struck beneath the breath of confession. A man could leave the brothel and pass a chapel within 100 steps. The same hands that closed in pleasure might soon fold in prayer. To the modern ear, this sounds like hypocrisy, but to the medieval city, it was governance. Sin, once catalogued, became manageable. The brothel keeper, often a widow or aging courtesan, paid a license fee to the city. Her income was registered, her building inspected. Guards patrolled to ensure no fights spilled into the streets. The church frowned, yes, but discreetly took its portion of the taxes. One chronicler in 14th century Avignon wrote that the bishop turned his eyes heavenward, but his purse remained on earth. Such lines were not satire, they were survival. For women, it was both cage and refuge. Many entered the trade because there was no other door left open. Wives abandoned, daughters without dowry, widows unable to work. These women found in the brothel a grim form of safety. The church preached that their souls could still be saved. Society treated them as necessary shadows. And thus, the city hummed with contradictions. Bells for prayer, songs for desire, judgments whispered between both. When you walked through its streets after midnight, you would see the moral landscape as clearly as the physical one. Tower, tavern, chapel, brothel, each a note in a single composition. Every light told a story, every silence held a secret. It wasn't lawlessness. It was balance, fragile, deliberate, human. A city built on sin it refused to abolish because it feared what might happen if it did. And so, in that strange half-light between virtue and vice, medieval life found its rhythm. The church forgave by day what it permitted by night. The law punished excess but licensed survival. And the people, ordinary, weary, faithful people, walked between both worlds without ever questioning why they had to. For them, morality was not absolute. It was a negotiation, carried out under the tolling of bells and the hum of unseen laughter. So if you ever wonder why prostitution was legal in these cities, the truth is not found in corruption alone, but in the quiet admission that the church, the crown, and the people all shared. To control desire, one must first acknowledge it. And as dawn approached, and the last candle in the red lanes guttered out, you could almost hear the sigh of the city itself, ashamed, relieved, alive. That is where our journey begins. We will step into the contradictions of faith itself, the priests, the sermons, and the strange theology that made sin a cornerstone of order. Morning has barely touched the rooftops, and the bells begin again, slow, deliberate. The rhythm of a city reminding itself that heaven still listens. The sound glides over market squares and through alleys where the night's laughter has not yet faded. The same priests who slept lightly after confession now rise to pray for souls they have already condemned and forgiven in the same breath. In medieval life, contradiction was not scandal, it was structure. And no institution embodied that paradox more completely than the church. To understand why the church allowed prostitution to exist, and at times even thrive, you must first understand its impossible position. The clergy were guardians of morality, yet also shepherds of human weakness. They preached chastity, but they ministered to flesh. They were taught that sin was inevitable, and that too much punishment could break the very souls they were sworn to save. So the church began to view prostitution not as rebellion, but as containment. In the language of theologians, it became a necessary evil. Augustine of Hippo had written centuries earlier, "Remove the prostitutes from human affairs, and you will unsettle everything with lust." That single sentence echoed through pulpits and councils for generations. To deny the body entirely was to invite chaos. In Paris, bishops signed ordinances marking where brothels could stand. In Cologne and Florence, city priests blessed water for purification ceremonies in houses of pleasure. They did not sanctify the trade, but they sanitized its presence. Sin, when regulated, became less threatening. It was a logic both chilling and deeply human. At Sunday Mass, priests thundered against fornication, painting images of eternal fire and divine punishment. But in quieter confessions, they offered forgiveness to men who had visited brothels, if they promised not to return too often. The line between salvation and indulgence was thin, and the church drew it with trembling hands. Documents from the 13th century reveal an uncomfortable truth. Some monasteries owned property that housed brothels. Rent was paid in coin blessed by priests who refused to speak of its source. This was not hypocrisy as much as it was survival, an institution feeding on the same city it tried to cleanse. Imagine standing in a cathedral during evening prayer. Candles flicker against carved angels, the choir's voices rise toward heaven. Yet beyond the thick stone walls, another choir hums. Women laughing, coins clinking, a different kind of devotion to the human condition. The two sounds never meet, but they exist in the same air. How did believers reconcile it? They didn't. They simply accepted that life was made of both light and shadow. The church, for all its authority, never sought to erase the shadow completely. To do so would be to erase humanity itself. Preachers in pulpits warned that lust was the devil's most persuasive whisper. But in the same breath, they admitted that men would fall. Better, they said, that lust should have a home than roam the streets untamed. Better that desire be confined to certain women, those already fallen, than threaten wives, daughters, or nuns. And so prostitution became, paradoxically, a guardian of virtue. By sacrificing a few, society preserved the illusion of purity for the rest. Theologians justified it with metaphors. Sin, they said, was like sewage, disgusting but essential to drain from the city lest it flood the streets. Brothels were the moral sewers of medieval Europe, unpleasant but necessary, tolerated because the alternative was worse. It's a thought that still unsettles. To preserve morality, they institutionalized sin. To defend holiness, they taxed desire. Many priests wrestled with this tension privately. Letters from confessors and friars reveal their fatigue. One wrote, "Each night I pray for the lost, and each morning I pass their door on the way to prayer. Their laughter burns my ears more than their sin." Another admitted to envying the women's honesty. "They know their guilt and do not disguise it. We pretend to purity and hide our wounds." Such honesty rarely survived official doctrine, but it whispered through the margins of sermons, in the pauses between words. The church, like the city itself, lived with its own divided soul. Even in this contradiction, there was care. Priests often acted as intermediaries when brothel women sought refuge or redemption. Many offered sanctuary to those wishing to leave the trade, arranging marriages or service in convent laundries. Behind the mask of institution, individual compassion persisted, a flicker of grace amid bureaucracy. Still, the duality never resolved. On feast days, processions passed near brothel quarters. The women were ordered to remain indoors, unseen, as banners of saints floated by. And when the last hymn faded, the same guards who enforced silence by day escorted clients by night. That was the rhythm: worship and desire, punishment and forgiveness, all turning in the same wheel. To live in that world was to accept paradox as nature. The church preached that man must resist temptation, while also insisting that he never could. Salvation required falling, and redemption required sin. Without sin, the church would have no work left to do. As evening fell again, the city seemed to breathe in rhythm with its faith. Bells called the faithful to prayer, and somewhere nearby, a door creaked open to laughter. Both were part of the same song, and both reached the same heaven. To us, it may sound like contradiction. To them, it was simply balance, an uneasy harmony between the spirit and the flesh. And as that balance endured, so did the strange permission that grew from it. The church would continue to condemn and protect, to punish and forgive. And through its contradictions, entire cities learned to build order out of sin. By now, the bells of the cathedral had stopped ringing, but their echoes lingered like ghosts over the city. Life resumed its rhythm, merchants shouting prices, children chasing pigeons, women drawing water from wells. The day seemed ordinary, but beneath the noise, another law ruled, one that few spoke of, yet everyone obeyed. It was not written in holy books, nor carved into stone tablets. It was a policy whispered between officials, a pact signed by silence, the management of sin. To understand why prostitution remained legal in so many medieval cities, one must look beyond religion and into governance. Kings and bishops might have blessed the idea of moral containment, but the true architects were the city councils, the pragmatic men who understood that stability mattered more than virtue. For them, vice was not an enemy to destroy, but a resource to manage. Records from Lubeck, Bruges, and Florence show that brothels were not hidden dens, but civic institutions. They were built near the outer walls, close to ports and markets, carefully distanced from cathedrals, but always within reach of travellers. They were registered like bakeries or stables, paying rent to the city. The keepers, often widows or elderly matrons, held licenses signed by magistrates. Taxes from their trade went directly into public funds. Imagine a city council chamber in the 14th century. Candles sputter over ink-stained documents, and men in fur-trimmed robes debate with measured tones. They speak not of salvation, but of sanitation. Not of sin, but of safety. If we close them, one alderman says, men will seek the streets, and the streets will seek trouble. Another nods. Better they go where the city can watch. A third dips his quill and writes what all understand. Regulation is cheaper than repression, and so prostitution became policy. Every transaction, every smile behind shuttered windows, was part of a larger machinery of order. The city gained revenue, the guards knew where to patrol, the streets stayed quieter. Brothels were even used as informal intelligence centers. Traveling merchants talked too freely when drunk, and courtesans carried news faster than messengers. Some city officials quietly encouraged this exchange of secrets, information disguised as affection. There was no moral clarity in these decisions, only strategy. The unspoken logic was simple. A man satisfied was a man pacified. Soldiers in garrisons, dock workers, masons, sailors, men whose restlessness could turn into riots, found release where the city permitted. The law did not celebrate it, but it preferred pleasure to rebellion. Thus, the brothel became a valve for social pressure. It was not justice, but it was management. At night, while the church prayed for purity, clerks counted the earnings of sin. The taxes collected from licensed brothels were used to maintain roads, repair bridges, and even fund hospitals. Chroniclers in Avignon wrote that the wages of vice built the walls of virtue. The irony was so perfect that it stopped being irony at all. Still, control demanded structure. Brothel women were registered in city ledgers, their names and ages noted like cattle inventory. They were forbidden to wear fine jewelry, forbidden to enter markets during daylight, forbidden to approach churches. The law called them necessary, but never worthy. A paradox again, legal but untouchable, accepted but despised. City guards enforced curfews not to protect the women, but to protect the illusion of morality. As long as vice stayed in its assigned quarters, the rest of the city could pretend to be clean. Yet every system of control breeds its own cracks. Beneath the surface, small rebellions stirred. Some brothel keepers secretly allowed women to keep a greater share of their earnings. Some guards looked the other way when a woman fled her registry to marry a client. Even within control, compassion found narrow paths. But compassion was not policy. The city's true concern was equilibrium. Too much indulgence would anger the church. Too much morality would anger the people. So the councils balanced like tightrope walkers, swaying above contradiction. In Venice, records show that the magistrates even set price limits for services, not to protect the women, but to prevent competition that could disrupt market stability. In Nuremberg, brothel colors were standardized, red lanterns by decree, to distinguish licensed establishments from illegal ones. The law turned desire into an inventory, and still, the church played its part, pretending not to notice what the city managed in plain sight. Priests blessed the men who funded roads with the money they spent on sin. The moral ledger balanced neatly. Indulgence bought charity. Lust built bridges. Confession cleansed it all. The unspoken policy worked because it was shared by all classes. Nobles visited in disguise. Merchants sponsored discreet establishments for their workers. Even city judges, who condemned adultery with grave faces, frequented the same quarters under cloak of darkness. Hypocrisy was not hidden. It was institutionalized. Yet beneath this careful choreography lay an uncomfortable truth. Control is not the same as understanding. By reducing desire to numbers, by turning women into statistics, the cities believed they had mastered human nature. But the heart, even in the Middle Ages, refused to obey ledgers. Occasionally, scandal broke the surface. A priest found in a forbidden house, a noble caught in a fight, a woman murdered by a jealous client. The city reacted with temporary outrage, then quietly resumed its order. The mechanism of control was stronger than emotion. Still, one could sense a quiet fatigue beneath the discipline. Men prayed to saints for forgiveness they no longer feared to ask. Women washed themselves in basins of cold water, whispering half-remembered hymns. And the city itself, its stones, its gates, its canals, seemed to sigh under the weight of its own rationality. For in truth, what the councils had created was not moral order, but moral anesthesia. A city that feels too much cannot govern. A city that feels nothing is already dying. And as the candles burned low in the council chambers, as ink dried on decrees, no one asked the question that might have changed everything. Not whether sin could be controlled, but whether it should be. Outside, the brothels glowed like tiny constellations in the dark, each window a reminder that control is never complete, only postponed. And from those lights, our next step begins, inside the walls of those houses, where lives were counted but rarely seen. Night in a medieval city was not a blanket of darkness. It was a map. Every street had a rule, every lamp a purpose, every silence a cost. If you followed the lamps long enough, you would find the edge of the lawful world, the Red Lantern District, the quarter of women whose names were written in registers but not in prayers. To outsiders, these places were pits of sin. To the city, they were proof of order. The brothels were never built at random. They stood by the gates, where travellers entered, near the riverfronts and markets, always close enough for commerce, but far enough to keep the illusion of sanctity intact. A man could sin before sunset, and still walk home through holy air before curfew. The geography of morality was as carefully designed as the walls themselves. From above, the city looked divided into rings of purity. At its heart, the cathedral, the council hall, the square of justice. Around it, the markets and guilds. Then, the taverns, the stables, the inns, and beyond, by the outer walls, the women's quarters. It was a city layered like conscience, clean at the centre, compromised at the edge. The walls that separated these zones were not only stone, they were made of silence, of unspoken rules. Everyone knew where the line was drawn. No sermons crossed it. No prayers were said beyond it. Yet, guards patrolled these alleys, just as they did the noble streets, collecting taxes, ensuring the peace, taking bribes when they wished. Regulation was meticulous. City clerks recorded the number of licensed houses, their addresses, their keepers' names, and even the colour of the curtains. Women who worked there had to register with the bailiff, sometimes branded with symbols on their documents, small marks of ownership disguised as administration. The purpose was not moral, it was managerial. Once a year, in many cities, inspectors made their rounds. They checked that the windows were shuttered during feast days, that no brothel operated near a church, that candles were properly enclosed to prevent fires. Officially, they were preserving public safety. Unofficially, they were counting the city's heartbeat. In the ledgers of Vienna and Lyon, one can still read the cold handwriting of bureaucracy. House of Solène, 3 women, 1 matron, clean. House of Marie, 5, 1 sick, license pending. House of Lucia, closed for disorder. Each line sounds like inventory, but each represents a life. The women were forbidden to solicit in the streets. They could not wear the same colours as wives or widows. Their shoes had to be plain, their veils a certain shade, brown, grey or striped, to mark them as separate. In some places, a ribbon of yellow was tied around the arm, a signal to the world. Here walks the tolerated sinner. Rules, always rules. In a time without mercy, rules were mistaken for justice. For many, this system brought an illusion of control. The church could point to the boundaries and declare that sin was contained. The magistrates could count the taxes and call the city stable. The citizens could walk past the walls and believe themselves clean. But the walls were porous. Desire, like smoke, found its way through cracks. Merchants from other towns sought comfort outside the designated quarter. Nobles hosted private feasts where the law dared not intrude. Behind closed doors, the same city that claimed control lost it willingly. The walls of morality were thin, and they heard everything. Inside, the brothel was its own kingdom of survival. The matron ruled with ledgers and warnings. Candles burned in iron sconces, the air thick with lavender to disguise sweat and wine. There were rules here too. A portion of every coin went to the house, another to the guard, another to the city. The rest, the smallest part, belonged to the women themselves. Some saved in secret purses, dreaming of escape. Some paid for protection, hoping for mercy. Some lit candles at dawn, whispering prayers through exhaustion. They were neither saints nor sinners. They were workers in a city that called them both. From the outside, the brothel seemed simple. Music, laughter, painted faces. Inside, it was a machine. Every minute was accounted for, every risk calculated. The walls served two masters. They protected the women from the streets, and they protected the streets from the women. Even punishment was regulated. If a woman was caught working without registration, she could be fined or expelled. In some cities, she was forced to wear a heavier mark, a visible badge that stripped away anonymity. The more the city controlled her, the safer it believed itself to be. But control is an illusion built on fear. There were nights when the watchman looked away and a song drifted over the wall, soft, trembling, almost like a prayer. A voice rising from inside the quarter, carrying across rooftops, mingling with the tolling of distant bells. For a moment, it was impossible to tell which sound belonged to holiness and which to sin. Perhaps that was the secret of these walls. They were never meant to divide good from evil, only to make the division look believable. And so, the city slept, convinced that regulation was righteousness. The brothels remained lit, the ledgers grew thicker, the laws multiplied. The moral architecture of the Middle Ages stood firm, not because it was just, but because it was convenient. Behind every rule, every wall, there was always a question, trembling but unanswered. If virtue must be protected by sin, what does that make virtue? The answer, of course, could not be written in any book. It was written in sighs, in footsteps echoing after curfew, in the rhythm of a city pretending to be pure. The night closes again over its secrets, and beyond the gates, a quieter truth waits. What happened to those who lived inside? The women who became both symbol and scapegoat. That is where the next step will take us. In every medieval city, the flow of money was as alive as the river that crossed its walls. It murmured through taverns, whispered in marketplaces, and trickled down into places where no sunlight reached. And among all those channels, one stream, quiet, steady, and forbidden, kept the whole city alive. The trade of desire. It was not called an economy, but it behaved like one. Behind the stone walls and the faded banners, beneath the towers that rang with the sound of church bells, the brothels pulsed with the same rhythm as the grain markets and harbour docks. Men came with coins. Women worked with silence. And the city, pretending to turn its face away, extended its hand behind its back. The councilmen who passed laws against lust were often the same who approved the taxes upon it. Brothels were licensed not in the name of sin, but of stability. Each house had to pay a quarter's fee to operate, plus an annual levy to the church for the cleansing of souls. That money built bridges, repaired roads, and funded city watch patrols. If morality filled the pulpit, immorality filled the treasury. From the doorway of a licensed house, the world seemed smaller, but clearer. The street outside was full of motion, porters, cooks, guards, and tailors, all depending on the women within. A single house employed candle makers, wine merchants, healers, musicians, and dressmakers. The more rules the city wrote, the more services bloomed around them. Every sin became someone else's trade. It was a hierarchy of necessity. A noble's indulgence meant coin for a cook, safety for a guard, and bread for a laundress. When the lamps of the quarter glowed at night, they lit the kitchens of the poor. Even the baker in the church square owed his warm loaves to the fevered nights at the city's edge. And though the priests cursed it from their pulpits, their churches burned candles funded by those same silver coins. There were ledgers for everything, dry, cold, and painfully detailed. The clerk's quill did not tremble when he wrote, "Receipts from the quarter, 7 florins for the repair of northern wall." Or levies upon the women's houses, 30 deniers, paid in full. Each number meant a life measured and converted into infrastructure. The women themselves were not citizens in the legal sense, but their bodies financed the safety of those who were. Every merchant knew it, every guard pretended not to. And so the city thrived, half by virtue, half by denial. The rhythm of this economy was set by the calendar. When soldiers returned from campaigns, the quarter swelled with laughter, coin, and song. During Lent, silence reigned, curtains drawn, as though guilt itself had been legislated. Feast days meant full rooms and tired smiles. Holy days meant hunger and patience. The women learned to count the seasons by the banners hanging from the cathedral and the mood of the streets. Prices moved with demand. A young knight, newly paid, would pay triple for a single night. A farmer, dusty from the road, might barter grain instead of coin. Some keepers preferred payment in candles or silk, which could be sold to guilds later. The economy of desire was not fixed. It adapted, alive, breathing through every loophole and law the city invented. Matriarchs who ran the houses became shrewd businesswomen. They kept two ledgers, one for the council, one for survival. They paid bribes to the watch, gifts to the clergy, and wages to musicians who kept customers distracted while guards collected their fees. These women were never praised, but they were indispensable. In the shadow of the cathedral, they built empires from whispers. Yet for all its efficiency, this world was built on exhaustion. Every coin earned was divided again. Part to the house, part to the city, part to the church, and the smallest part to the woman who earned it. And even that smallest part carried invisible debts. To the healer who treated her wounds, the tailor who patched her dress, the baker who sold her food on credit. When morning came, she counted her coins not as wealth, but as permission to continue. There was irony in how the system named itself moral. By allowing the sin to exist in plain sight, the city claimed to control it. By taxing it, the council claimed to sanctify it, and by profiting from it, the church claimed to redeem it. Thus, order was preserved, and no one had to question the truth. The city's purity was paid for by its corruption. The brothels themselves reflected this duality. Inside, they were decorated not with luxury, but with illusion. Curtains of red and gold that caught the light of oil lamps. Walls painted with fading murals of gardens, rivers, and skies. The air was thick with herbs, both for scent and for protection. Perfume to cover wine. Lavender to mask sickness. Myrrh to make the soul forget. And behind every painted smile was an arithmetic of survival. The city guard walked past those doors each night, pretending indifference but remembering faces. Some guards took their pay in silence. Others demanded more tangible favors. Regulation meant control, but control was simply another form of participation. What was forbidden for the poor was forgiven for those who enforced the rules. Even the church could not untangle itself from this web. Abbeys owned property near these districts, collecting rent from the houses that tempted the faithful. Confession boxes were filled with the same voices that paid their tithes faithfully the next day. Priests who thundered against sin by daylight whispered forgiveness by night for a donation. It was not hypocrisy, it was equilibrium. And for the women themselves, equilibrium was survival. They learned the hours of curfew by heart, the patrol routes of guards, the faces of men who came not for pleasure but for power. They learned when to speak and when to stay silent, when to look a man in the eye and when to stare through him. Every lesson was paid for in pain. Every night was a transaction written on skin instead of parchment. Still, within that cruel balance, some built fragments of comfort. They formed quiet sisterhoods, pooling money for the sick, hiding coins in walls, lighting candles for the dead. When one disappeared, her name was whispered, not written. When one escaped, her absence was celebrated in silence. Even here, humanity persisted, fragile, secret, and defiant. By the time dawn came, the city awoke to the smell of bread and incense. The brothel shutters closed. The baker smiled. The church bells rang. The same people who profited from the night blessed the morning sun. And so, the circle began again. No one called it an economy, but it was the oldest one. Desire was not just pleasure, it was infrastructure. It built streets, funded armies, paid priests, and kept order. And in that irony lay the quiet genius of the medieval world. Sin could be measured, priced, and made useful. But deeper questions still lingered. If the city allowed one kind of immorality to prevent another, what did that make the city itself? Was it protecting virtue, or simply selling its illusion? That thought hung in the air like smoke, rising above the rooftops as the bells tolled for morning prayer. And somewhere, a woman counting her coins by candlelight smiled without joy, because she knew what came next. A new justification, more elegant, more dangerous. The belief that their suffering existed to protect the innocent. When the city finally dared to justify its own contradictions, it found a new phrase to wash the guilt away. For the protection of the innocent. It sounded pure. It sounded holy. But those words, spoken in council halls and whispered in churches, hid the darkest logic of all. If men were given a place to release their hunger, they said, the rest of the city would sleep safely. If desire could be contained, the virtue of wives and daughters would remain untouched. And so, the law that permitted one kind of shame was rebranded as a shield of morality. That was how the lie became a pillar. The idea began in small meetings between magistrates and clerics. They called it preventive mercy. Brothels were to be tolerated, not as dens of sin, but as barriers against chaos. Behind closed doors, a city could control the unpredictable. On parchment, it was written elegantly, to safeguard the chastity of the good by granting release to the weak. But in practice, it was cruel mathematics. The suffering of a few women was turned into the supposed protection of many. Their lives were treated as walls, soft walls, invisible walls, built to keep purity intact. A nobleman might say, better one woman's dishonor than 100 daughters violated. A priest might nod, thinking of his sermon's peace, and the city would carry on, clean in words, dirty in truth. Inside the brothels, the women heard the same phrases over and over again, drifting in like smoke through thin windows. We do this for order. It keeps our wives safe. You should be grateful. You serve a holy purpose. Holy purpose. What a strange comfort it was, to be told your pain saved others. It did not save anyone. It simply silenced them. The church adopted the rhetoric with ease. In some towns, priests were ordered to bless the districts once a year, sprinkling holy water on the doors that glowed red at night. It was said to purify the air and guide the lost back to faith. The irony was breathtaking. Men would kneel in church at dawn, confessing what they did by candlelight, and walk home proud, believing that their sin had been tamed into service for the greater good. And what of the women? They were not called by name in those prayers. Their souls were not discussed in the sermons. They were instruments, not believers, sacrifices, not citizens. The council recorded them as licensed subjects. The church listed them as fallen daughters. And society looked at them with the same expression used for rain gutters, necessary but unpleasant to mention. In the taverns, the logic spread like spilled ale. Without them, no woman would be safe. Men repeated it until they believed it. Some even said it with pity, others with pride. They thought they were keeping peace, when in truth, they were maintaining a cycle. For every woman called impure, 10 others were declared pure. For every sin contained, 1,000 unspoken ones were excused. And in that imbalance, the city found its illusion of virtue. The protectors of innocence never asked the women what they thought. If they had, they would have heard the simplest answer. Innocence cannot be bought with another's ruin. But no one wanted to hear that, because it broke the comfort of the myth. A healer who worked in the quarter once told a magistrate, "You call them sinners to keep your streets calm. You should call them guardians, because they guard your illusions." He laughed, but she did not. The illusion reached even the highest towers. The queen herself, once rumoured to be sympathetic, was advised not to close the brothels for fear of stirring unrest among soldiers. She said nothing after that. Silence, too, became part of governance. In cities like Avignon and Prague, the reasoning was codified into law. Documents survive that state, in Latin script, that regulated houses diminish the wicked urge of men. It was the oldest moral trade ever written. Virtue for coin, peace for pain. And so, the women became the boundary stones of a civilization that would never name them. They stood between two worlds, the one that desired them and the one that condemned them. Each night, they protected the same men who shamed them by day. At dawn, when the bells rang, they watched husbands leave, carrying the scent of guilt home to wives who thanked God for protection. And somewhere, between that prayer and the truth, the idea of innocence cracked like thin glass. Still, the story did not end there. Some began to question whether the walls truly protected anyone at all. Whispers spread through the convents and marketplaces, whispers of hypocrisy, of hidden lust behind vows, of priests who preached chastity but practiced secrecy. And those whispers would soon rise into questions too loud to silence. Because every system built on sacrifice eventually demands an answer. Who decides who must be sacrificed? And what happens when the innocent are no longer content to be protected by someone else's pain? The bells of the cathedral tolled 7 times, slow and heavy, echoing through the stone corridors like the heartbeat of the city itself. Inside the convent walls, silence reigned. The air smelled of wax and dust and a faint trace of fear, the kind of fear that hides beneath obedience. Here, in the hush of the cloister, sin was not an act, it was a question. And that question was asked again and again until it became a ritual of its own. Each week, the sisters lined up in the corridor outside the confessional, their bare feet brushed against the cold flagstones. One by one, they entered the wooden box, where a single candle burned behind the screen, and the priest's voice waited, soft, patient, relentless. Have you been pure of mind? Have your dreams been clean? Have you touched or been touched in thought or in flesh? The questions came not like accusations, but like traps laid in velvet. The priests said confession was mercy. The women knew it was control. No sound carried through the walls except whispers and the faint rustle of habits. But if you stood close enough, you could hear the rhythm of breath, the pauses that betrayed shame, the sound of paper as sins were recorded, not with names, but with codes. 1 mark for thoughts, 2 for acts, 3 for repetition. Those marks built records, and those records became weapons. It began as theology. The church taught that the body was a vessel of temptation, especially a woman's. To cleanse it, one had to expose every shadow to the light of God. But in practice, confession became something else, a mirror held too close, reflecting not holiness, but obsession. Some priests demanded detail in the name of precision. Describe how temptation approached you, they would say. Where did it begin? What did you feel? The penitent hesitated, trembling. To confess was to relive. To be forgiven was to be broken open first. The more vivid the description, the more power shifted to the listener. And behind the wooden lattice, the listener always remained unseen. There were stories whispered among the nuns, stories of priests who grew too curious, of confessions that turned into interrogations, of tears mistaken for devotion. And through it all, the church said it was cleansing the soul. But the truth was simpler and more human. Confession had become a map of desire, every secret drawn in words, every fear catalogued and studied, every woman made to believe that her body was a battlefield between heaven and hell. Inside the convent, the sisters prayed to silence their thoughts. They fasted, scourged themselves, bathed in cold water until their lips turned blue, all to drown the imagined sin before it reached the confessional again. The more they denied their flesh, the stronger it seemed to rebel. At night, when the wind passed through the cloister arches, they heard whispers that might have been prayer or guilt. One novice confessed that she dreamed of warmth and woke in tears, certain that even her sleep had betrayed her vow. Another spent hours kneeling, begging God to erase memory itself, and so the circle continued. Temptation, guilt, confession, penance. A wheel that turned endlessly, powered by fear and maintained by faith. To the priests, it was order. To the women, it was torment sanctified by ritual. Somewhere beyond the walls, in the city's brothels, women sold their bodies to survive. Inside these walls, women sold their souls to stay pure. Both were bound by the same system, one paid in coin, the other in confession. The church saw itself as guardian of virtue, but what it guarded most was knowledge. The confession books, kept under lock and key, contained the city's hidden anatomy. Who sinned, who resisted, who doubted. To control sin was to control the soul. To control the soul was to rule the world. And for that control, detail was everything. A vague confession could not be forgiven, they said. The devil hides in generalities, so the questions cut deeper until the sinner became a narrator of her own undoing. Where were your hands? What words were spoken? How long did the thought remain? To speak was to surrender. To be silent was to defy God. In some convents, confessors visited the sisters at night, claiming it was safer for modesty's sake. A curtain hung between them, a symbol of purity. But curtains do not stop hunger. Behind the veil, the sound of breath could still be heard. Sometimes the questions lingered too long. Sometimes the answers trembled too much. The line between confession and corruption blurred, and no one dared to draw it again. A few brave women began to write about it, secretly, in Latin or in coded French, their ink mixed with candle soot. They spoke of priests who used confession to learn the desires of their flock, of bishops who read those records not to absolve but to govern. Those writings were hidden, then burned. But some fragments survived, tucked into prayer books or sewn behind tapestries. They read like warnings. The more the soul is forced to speak, the less it belongs to God. Outside the convent, the same mechanism spread through every parish. Confession became a civic tool. Husbands confessed their lust, merchants their greed, soldiers their cruelty, and all were recorded. The church had built not just a system of faith, but a surveillance of conscience. And through it all, women bore the heaviest burden. They were told that silence was sin and speech was salvation. But every word spoken stripped away another piece of privacy, another piece of peace. Forgiveness had become performance. Faith had become fear. And the sacred act of confession had become a theatre of control. In time, even priests began to lose themselves in the details they demanded. Some confessed their own temptations to hire clergy. Others vanished quietly into monasteries, their names replaced by rumors. One chronicler wrote that a confessor in Toulouse drowned himself in the river after realizing he had learned too much about the souls of women and too little about his own. No one spoke of it again. But the whispers continued, echoing through stone and candlelight, shaping the idea that the holiest institutions could hide the darkest desires. By the end of the century, confession had ceased to be a mirror of repentance. It had become a record of humanity's most intimate struggle, transcribed in fear. And those who kept those records believed they held dominion not just over sin, but over truth itself. The walls of the convent stood tall, but the real prison was invisible, the belief that purity could only exist through pain. Outside, the city changed. The markets grew busier, the brothels hummed with music. The same men who whispered to priests by day returned to the red doors by night, unburdened and ready to sin again. It was a perfect balance, confession and indulgence, guilt and relief, all neatly contained within the city's spiritual economy. Behind those convent doors, one question began to take shape, trembling and dangerous. If the church must know every secret to forgive, does it still serve God or itself? Night in the city no longer felt shame. The glow of lanterns outside the quarter had dimmed, but their purpose had not. The lie had already rooted too deep, that every lamp burning red was a guardian's light, keeping innocence safe in the shadows beyond. It was the perfect illusion. Men convinced themselves that their sins were a service, that the coins they spent were tokens of civic virtue. Each brothel, they said, was a wall that kept chaos out, a silent, breathing sacrifice that allowed others to live untouched. The rhetoric spread like scripture. Priests repeated it from pulpits. God forgives the sinner who restrains himself within law. Magistrates echoed it in courtrooms, better order than scandal. And merchants whispered it in taverns over wine, proud that their indulgence had become an act of public duty. The truth was much simpler. It was not protection. It was purchase. The city had found a way to turn morality into an economy, and guilt into governance. Every act of desire became a transaction of power. The women, stripped of name and virtue, became the coin by which men bought their own peace of mind. Inside the houses, the words "protecting the innocent" became a curse. The women heard it in laughter, in drunken apologies, in trembling confessions at dawn. "Forgive me," they said. "I only do this to save my wife, to preserve my daughter's purity." As if pain could be recycled into virtue. No law, no sermon. No priest ever asked the women if they wanted to be the city's shield. No one asked if innocence should cost someone else's life. The myth worked because it was convenient. It let the powerful sleep with clean hands and heavy conscience, because guilt, when shared with God, becomes lighter. The city's architecture of sin stood balanced upon that lie, that virtue could be maintained through the suffering of the unseen. But the unseen began to notice. In the quiet rooms after curfew, women whispered between beds, trading not secrets of love, but stories of hypocrisy. They spoke of nobles who came in priestly robes, of judges who preached chastity but carried them like trophies, of guards who claimed to protect them while taking their earnings. The phrase "protecting the innocent" grew bitter on their tongues. It was no longer a justification. It was a ghost that haunted their sleep. One woman, older than the rest, once said softly, "If we are their protection, then who protects us?" No one answered. The silence that followed was colder than any winter night. Beyond the quarter, wives lived in comfort, certain that their virtue was intact. They did not see the bruises that bought their peace. They did not hear the coughs behind the painted walls, the prayers whispered by those who would never kneel in church again. And yet, even among the women, the myth took hold. Some began to believe that their work did preserve something sacred, that without them, the city would devour itself. It was easier to live with pain if it could be called purpose. The brothel keepers encouraged the thought. "You are serving the greater good," they told the newcomers. "You make the world stable." They said it like a blessing, though their eyes counted profit more than salvation. The city's chroniclers, those who wrote history for the noble courts, omitted the truth with careful precision. They mentioned regulated houses, modest establishments, women of the lower kind, but they never mentioned names. In their records, the women became invisible ink, present everywhere, readable nowhere. Even the church preferred silence. Its officials claimed that tolerating sin was an act of mercy, for it prevented greater evil. In their logic, the women were the lesser fire, burning to save the forest. But mercy has a scent, and it was not the scent of incense. It was sweat, iron, and candle wax, andal. It was the smell of a system too afraid to call itself cruel. Over time, the illusion began to crack. Some priests refused to bless the districts. Others tore down their pulpits in protest. A few confessed that their sermons were lies, that purity cannot exist on the back of someone else's suffering. Their words were quiet, but the church heard them like thunder. Soon, new orders of reformers appeared, men and women who questioned the balance of sin and salvation. They walked through the same streets that the city tried to hide, counting not the lamps, but the faces beneath them. They spoke of compassion, not control, of freedom, not forgiveness bought with coins. For the first time, someone asked aloud, if protecting the innocent means sacrificing the powerless, then who decided which souls are worth saving? That question did not die. It lingered like a secret draft beneath the heavy doors of the cathedral, carried by the night wind, waiting for someone brave enough to open them. And inside the quarter, as the candles burned lower, one woman looked toward the window and whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. It was the first prayer the city would not hear, and the only one that was truly honest. The city had grown comfortable in its illusion, like a patient who had learned to live with a slow fever. The system still functioned. Laws were obeyed, taxes collected, sins recorded, but beneath the surface, small fractures had begun to appear. They were not loud. They were whispers, rumors, confessions, half-spoken in candlelight. In time, whispers are more dangerous than screams. It began with silence that refused to stay silent. A clerk in the magistrate's office, tired of counting the same names on the same lists, noticed that some never returned from the quarter. Dead of sickness, the report said, though no physician had ever been called. He mentioned it to his superior, who simply shook his head. They die so that others may live without temptation, the man answered, as if reciting scripture. The clerk nodded, but he wrote the names again, this time in his own book, hidden beneath the floorboards. Elsewhere, a young priest lingered outside the quarter long after curfew. He was not there for indulgence, but for confession. The women trusted him, perhaps because he did not ask for details of their bodies, only their hearts. One of them, frail and coughing, told him, "They say we protect the innocent, but who protects us from the innocent?" The priest could not answer. That night, he tore a page from his sermon and burned it before dawn. Rumors spread like veins of ink through parchment. A nobleman's son was found dead after visiting the regulated houses, poisoned by cheap wine meant to dull fear. His father demanded vengeance, but not against the wine seller. He blamed the women, calling them demons in disguise. The city applauded the accusation. It was easier to damn the visible than question the invisible. Some began to question anyway. A physician who treated the city's poor wrote in his journal that the sicknesses spreading beyond the quarter were not curses, but contagions. The disease did not respect walls or virtue. It traveled with the men who believed themselves righteous, returning home to kiss their wives and children with infected lips. The illusion of containment cracked. For the first time, the quarter's gates no longer marked the border between purity and sin. Disease, rumor, and conscience leaked through like smoke. In taverns, men began to speak with unease. "If the houses keep us safe," one said, "why do the streets reek of death?" Another replied, "Perhaps the angels guarding us have grown tired." They laughed afterward, but their laughter trembled. The church noticed. Some priests pressed for stricter control, more walls, more silence. Others whispered reform. A few dared to say that the doctrine itself was a sin, a bargain made not with God but with convenience. Their words reached Rome, carried by frightened messengers who sealed letters with trembling wax. Meanwhile, inside the quarter, the women sensed the shift before anyone else. Clients spoke less, paid less, prayed more. Fear replaced arrogance. One woman, once defiant, began keeping a small ledger of her own, not of money, but of faces. "Every man who claims to serve God," she wrote, "carries the same shadow behind his eyes." Her notes, passed secretly between rooms, became a kind of scripture of the damned. They chronicled hypocrisy more carefully than any church record. The women, though still prisoners, had become historians of their own captivity. One winter evening, a storm flooded the lower streets. The gates of the quarter, meant to contain temptation, were broken by the water. When morning came, the guards found the signs washed clean. The line between sin and salvation had been erased by rain. In the days that followed, strange things occurred. A bishop ordered a public prayer for the fallen, and hundreds gathered, not to condemn, but to listen. Someone read aloud the name of a woman who had died in one of the houses, her body unclaimed. For the first time, the city mourned one of its invisible. The crowd did not disperse easily. Something in them had changed. From that day, the whispers grew louder. A scholar at the university began writing treatises questioning the logic of necessary sin. A merchant refused to collect taxes from the quarter, saying, "I will not profit from pain." The magistrate's clerk, the one who had written hidden names, was arrested for treason. He disappeared, but his ledger survived, smuggled out by the same priest who had burned his sermon. The doctrine that had once seemed invincible began to unravel, thread by thread. It was not destroyed by rebellion or decree, but by recognition, the slow, unbearable awareness that what was called protection was simply permission to ignore suffering. And through it all, the women continued their work, though their voices no longer trembled. They knew the truth now, and truth is a dangerous companion. It keeps one awake at night. One of them, the oldest among them, was heard saying to a visiting priest, "You think you have built a wall against sin, but you built a mirror." The priest said nothing. He left his rosary on her table and never returned. From the rooftops, the bells rang as they always did, calling the faithful to prayer. Yet the sound had changed. It echoed through streets that no longer believed in their own sanctity. That night, as the storm clouds cleared, a faint light appeared over the quarter. Pale, fragile, but steady. Some said it was a sign of redemption. Others thought it was only dawn. But for the first time, the city did not look away. It began softly, like a cough in the dark, barely noticed, easily ignored. But whispers have a way of growing, especially when the world above them refuses to listen. The illusion that had wrapped the city for generations was fraying. Every sermon that once promised order now echoed hollow in the vaulted ceilings. People still prayed, but fewer eyes closed. The first voices of change did not come from nobles or scholars. They came from those who had seen too much. A physician, his hands trembling from years of treating bodies the law refused to name, began writing letters, never signed, always left beneath church doors. "You call them sinners," he wrote, "but their sickness is yours. You created the walls that trap them." His letters were gathered and burned, but ashes are also seeds. A few weeks later, an old nun who had tended the sick near the quarter began speaking during evening prayers. Her voice was frail but clear. "If the Lord's mercy is infinite," she asked, "why must we build prisons for it?" The sisters warned her to stop. The abbess demanded silence. But silence is brittle, and faith that has seen too much begins to splinter. The church called these murmurs dangerous compassion. Officials reminded the people that disorder was worse than sin. Better a single wound, they said, than 1,000 infected hearts. But the metaphor no longer convinced. The city was bleeding already, and no one could agree on which cut to heal first. Some of the women themselves began to vanish from the quarter, not by force, but by choice. They disappeared into monasteries disguised as servants, or into villages where no one asked questions. One became a midwife and whispered to mothers during labor, "Do not let your daughters be sacrificed for the virtue of men." The phrase spread faster than any sermon. Others stayed, believing that leaving would change nothing. They began writing their own stories in code, songs that sounded like lullabies, but each verse carried confession and defiance. Children hummed them in the streets without knowing their origin. The songs were their rebellion, melodies soft enough to survive the gallows. Meanwhile, within the city's council, a young magistrate named Aurelian questioned the records of taxation. He found discrepancies, gold that vanished between the brothels and the bishop's treasury. When he asked about it, his colleagues advised him to forget. "You are young," they said. "Faith is more profitable than truth." But Aurelian kept the papers. History remembers only those who refuse to forget. The movement had no leader, no banners, no clear shape. It was not a revolution, but a contagion of conscience. Every person who doubted the old law became a silent conspirator. Every unspoken question was a spark beneath the marble floors. Then, one evening, in a quiet chapel by the river, a small group gathered. A priest who had left his order, a physician, 2 women from the quarter, and the nun who had once defied her abbess. They brought no weapons, only candles and words. "We are told that sin is necessary," the priest said. "Perhaps the lie was necessary once, but now it kills us." The room fell silent, not in fear, but in recognition. They called themselves the witnesses, though no one else ever did. They swore to speak truth wherever the lie was comfortable. Their gatherings were brief, their letters unsigned. Yet somehow, their words found their way into homilies, into taverns, even into the halls of law. People began to quote them without knowing who they were. Virtue that feeds on suffering is not virtue. The church reacted swiftly. Edicts were issued, accusing unknown heretics of spreading unrest. Whispers became crimes. To question the system was to wound the body of Christ, they said. But repression only sharpened the whisper. It moved like wind, invisible but persistent, finding cracks even in stone. Some nights, guards reported hearing voices in the cathedral long after curfew, singing, low and mournful. They searched the pews and found nothing, only a single candle still burning near the altar. On its base, scratched into the wax, were 5 words: "Mercy is not control." By now, the people were listening. They did not riot or shout. They simply stopped believing. The spell of justification, once ironclad, began to weaken. A merchant refused to pay the city's protection tax. A group of scholars debated publicly whether holiness could be bought with someone else's pain. Even a bishop, rumoured to have lost his son to the quarter's sickness, wept during Mass and said, "If this is mercy, may God forgive our mercy." Change rarely announces itself with trumpets. It grows like dawn, unnoticed, until light touches everything. The doctrine that had once chained desire to duty was fading. For the first time, the city's conscience stirred not from guilt, but from empathy. And though no one dared to say it aloud, a question now lived on every tongue. If sin could be managed, could virtue also be corrupt? That question would not die. It would haunt the pulpits, the courts, and the dreams of those who still believed they were pure. For the whisper had become a presence, and once truth learns to speak, even softly, it never stops. There comes a moment in every empire of lies when silence can no longer hold. The city that once whispered now trembled openly. The illusion that had endured for centuries, of sin managed, of virtue maintained through suffering, was breaking apart like stained glass under thunder. It began with fever. No one remembered who fell first. Some said it was a soldier returning from war. Others swore it was a merchant's wife. What mattered was that it spread faster than prayer. Within weeks, the streets that had once traded pleasure became corridors of coughing and smoke. The quarter, the very place once said to contain corruption, was sealed shut. Guards nailed planks across its gates, muttering blessings they no longer believed. But the sickness did not obey walls. It moved with the wind, carried on breath and touch, indifferent to class or creed. The irony was merciless. The city that had justified suffering as protection now suffered without protection. Church bells tolled day and night, first for the dying, then for the dead, and finally for no one at all. The priests who had defended the doctrine fell ill, their sermons turning to murmurs between gasps. One bishop, delirious with fever, was heard crying, "Forgive us for building our purity upon their bones." The markets emptied, the cathedrals filled. Men knelt beside women they had condemned, begging forgiveness from faces they no longer recognized. For the first time, no one cared who was holy. Everyone was simply human, fragile and afraid. In the quarter, those who survived began tending to the sick who had once feared them. Elise, frail but alive, boiled herbs and pressed damp cloths to burning foreheads. "We were the unclean," she whispered, "but now we cleanse." Around her, the dying called her name like a prayer. The church tried to reclaim control. Decrees were issued, fasts, processions, purges. None worked. The disease cared nothing for penance. In desperation, some clergy blamed the women again, calling the fever divine retribution. But the people no longer listened. They had seen too much. The mirror from the previous night still hung in their memory, reflecting truth with brutal calm. A rumour spread that the fever began not in the quarter, but in the bishop's palace, carried by servants returning from secret visits. The rumor became conviction. Conviction became fury. One night, a mob gathered before the cathedral. They carried no torches, only the same lamp Elise had once lit years before. Someone set it on the steps, its light trembling in the wind. No one shouted. They did not come for vengeance. They came for an ending. Inside, Abbot Lucian stood at the altar. He had aged beyond his years, his robe loose on his shoulders. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "the plague is mercy." His words spread through the hall like smoke. "Perhaps God is not punishing us. Perhaps he is freeing those we enslaved to our virtue." No one answered. The priests around him wept. That night, the cathedral's great cross fell, not struck by hand, but by rot. The wood splintered, the chain snapped, and the sound echoed across the sleeping city. People said it was thunder. Others said it was the sound of truth unbinding itself. The following morning, the gates of the quarter were found open. No one had touched them. The hinges had rusted away. Men and women walked through the streets side by side, no longer separated by law or shame. The fever was still taking lives, but it had taken something else first. The illusion that anyone could be pure while another suffered. As the days passed, the city's hierarchy dissolved. Wealth meant little when the rich died as easily as the poor. Confession became conversation. Communion became compassion. For the first time, there was no doctrine, only decency. Sister Amara's book, once banned, was now read aloud in marketplaces. Not as scripture, but as remembrance. "We were told to protect the innocent," someone read. "We were the innocent." The crowd repeated the line like a psalm. By the end of the season, half the city was gone. But in its ruins, something new grew. A strange, quiet tenderness. People shared food, stories, prayers without hierarchy. The church no longer issued decrees. Its bells were silent. And in the midst of the stillness, Elise passed away in her sleep. They buried her in the cathedral garden, where the light fell through shattered glass in colours that once belonged to saints. On her gravestone, someone carved only 2 words: "No more." When spring came, grass grew through the cracks of the broken streets. The air smelled of rain instead of incense. The city had been cleansed, not by holiness, but by humility. It was the end of the illusion and the beginning of truth. Morning returned to the city like an apology. The air was clean, but too quiet, as if the world itself was hesitant to breathe again. Streets once filled with the noise of trade and laughter now carried only the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, fragile. The fever had passed, but its shadow lingered. Empty houses stood beside gardens blooming wild, monuments to lives unrecorded. Those who survived moved softly, their voices low, as though afraid that sound might summon the ghosts of what they had done, or what they had allowed. In the cathedral garden, where Elise rested beneath the broken glass, grass had begun to grow over her grave. Each blade was thin and bright, pushing through the soil like a whisper, life insisting itself. Every morning, someone left a candle by the stone that read, "No more." No one knew who, but the act never ceased. The church was no longer the same. Its doors stayed open day and night. People entered not for confession, but for company. There were no sermons, only stories. The priests no longer wore gold, and the bishops no longer gave orders. They sat beside farmers, widows, and the few women who had survived the quarter, listening as equals. One of them, a former priest who had once preached the doctrine of necessary sin, spent his days washing the steps of the cathedral. When asked why, he said, "I am cleansing what cannot be cleansed." There was no punishment for him, no penance to perform. The city had grown tired of judgment. The people no longer asked who was guilty. They asked what could be made right. Children played near the old gates that once divided the pure from the fallen. They didn't know what the gates had meant, only that they were good for climbing. Their laughter carried across the stones, filling the silence that had once been ruled by sermons. In the market, coins changed hands without oaths or excuses. prices were simple, and no one spoke of sin. There was hunger, there was kindness, there was memory, but no illusion. Sister Amara's book, The Mirror of the Forsaken, was now read openly, not as scripture, but as history. In every copy, someone had added a final page in their own handwriting. Most wrote prayers. Some wrote apologies. A few wrote only names. Abbot Lucian, older and bent, continued to live in the monastery by the river. He no longer preached, he gardened. "It is strange," he said once to a traveller, "how the soil forgives what men cannot." The traveller asked if he still believed in innocence. Lucien smiled sadly. "Innocence?" he said. "No, but I believe in gentleness, and that is better." At dusk, the city began lighting lamps again. Not red, not for sale, but white, soft, humble. Each window held one, glowing quietly against the night. It was not celebration, it was remembrance. The people had learned that purity was not something to be protected. It was something to be shared, fragile and fleeting, like the flame in their windows. A widow who had lost her son to the fever began tending to Elise's grave. She cleaned the stone each morning, whispering, "You were the wall they built to keep us safe." Then she paused and added, "We were wrong to need walls. The church kept no more records of sin. The ledgers had been burned during the plague, and no one rewrote them. In their place, the scribes began compiling names of the dead, without judgment. Their book was titled The Testament of All. When it was finished, they placed it beside the altar and never opened it again. The people said the city had been forgiven, though no one could say by whom. Perhaps forgiveness, like guilt, had never belonged to God alone. Every night, when the wind passed through the old quarter, it carried the faint scent of herbs and wax. Some said it was Elise's spirit. Others said it was the city remembering itself. Whatever it was, it brought peace. Not the peace of silence, but the peace of truth. As years went by, travelers visited the city and asked about the strange motto carved above the cathedral gate, "The price of innocence." No one could tell them who wrote it. Some said it was the bishop before his death. Others swore it appeared overnight. But every resident understood its meaning. They had paid it, and in their payment, they had finally become human again. The road beyond Liriath wound through the hills like a scar that the earth had learned to live with. Isolde walked in silence, her boots heavy with rain and memory. Behind her, the city's towers blurred into mist, their bells now nothing more than echoes devoured by the wind. She had spent years beneath those bells, believing each toll was a reminder of her shame. Now, she realized they were simply hollow metal, calling for the living to remember the dead. The forest opened before her, endless, green, and unjudging. Every step felt like shedding a layer of someone else's morality. For the first time, she did not pray. For the first time, she simply listened. To the breath of leaves, the distant river, the sound of her own heartbeat, raw and steady like a hymn she had never been allowed to sing. When the sun rose, she found herself at a small chapel, half swallowed by ivy. Its roof had caved in, its door hung by one hinge, and moss covered the altar. Inside, a single candle still flickered, impossibly alive, its flame trembling as if startled to see her. She smiled faintly. Perhaps faith had not abandoned the world entirely. It had just learned to hide from the righteous. She knelt, not in worship, but in remembrance. Her hands, once instruments of other people's desires, now rested open on her knees. "Forgiveness," she whispered, "is not theirs to give." That sentence hung in the air, and something in her, something small and stubborn, finally unclenched. For years, the church had called her impure, a vessel of necessity, a sin made flesh. But what if sin was only the name given by the powerful to the powerless when they refused to break? What if purity had never belonged to anyone? The rain eased. Through the cracked roof, light spilled onto her face, pale and tender. In that moment, she understood what Iran had tried to teach her. that redemption was not a return to virtue, but the acceptance of one's humanity. She stayed in the chapel for days. Villagers occasionally passed, leaving bread or fruit at the threshold, mistaking her for a penitent or hermit. She thanked them, but never explained. The world had too many explanations and too little silence. Each night, she wrote, on scraps of parchment, in charcoal and candle soot, she recorded the names of every woman she could remember, the living and the dead. Their laughter, their pain, their stories, not as confessions, but as testaments. She titled the first page, "The Innocent Who Saved the Guilty." It was not meant as accusation. It was meant as truth. By spring, others came. A young woman from the city, one of the girls she had once protected, arrived first, carrying a torn piece of the bishop's decree. Then Lorraine, the doctor, bringing herbs and a quiet grief that words could not touch. Finally, a traveller with worn boots and a satchel of ink-stained paper. Iran. He had returned, older, thinner, but his eyes still burning with belief. They said nothing for a long time. Then Iran opened the Book of the Silent Ones and placed it beside her new pages. 2 volumes, born from the same wound. He smiled. "History will forget us," he said. "But maybe it will remember what we tried to change." Isolde looked at him. "It doesn't need to remember us," she said softly. "It only needs to stop repeating." That night, they buried the books beneath the chapel floor, not to hide them, but to root them, so that the stories of the silenced might one day bloom through the cracks of stone and sanctimony. Years passed. The chapel became a refuge, not a brothel, not a church, something in between, a place where women who had been cast aside could rest without judgment. Travellers spoke of it as the house of the dawn, where the weary were fed and the lost were heard. No one asked names, no one demanded repentance. They simply shared silence until it healed something unseen. In time, the legend grew. Some said a saint lived there, a woman who had carried the sins of a city and laid them to rest. Others claimed it was haunted by the ghosts of those who had been wronged. But those who truly found the place said there were no ghosts at all, only a feeling of immense gentleness, like a wound learning how to close. One evening, many years later, a group of travellers approached the old road to Liriath. They found the chapel gone, reduced to stones and wildflowers. Only the foundation remained, overgrown but sturdy. At its centre, a single bell rested on the ground. No tower, no rope, just the bell itself. And beside it, carved into the stone, the faint outline of a sun with a single dot at its heart. When the wind blew through the hollow metal, it made a sound so soft it was almost human. Not a cry, not a prayer, but a release. One traveller turned to the others. "Do you think this was a holy place?" he asked. An old woman smiled. "Holiness is what we build when guilt forgets its purpose," she said. This was something better. They walked on, leaving the bell to ring for no one, for everyone. Centuries later, historians found mention of St. Magdalen's Row only in fragments. A line in a tax record, a scribbled note in a bishop's diary. But in one forgotten monastery, a monk found 2 damp-bound volumes sealed in a clay urn. The ink had faded, but the title remained. "The Innocent Who Saved the Guilty." He read the first line. They called it mercy. We called it survival. He did not understand all of it, but he felt something stir, a discomfort that might one day become empathy. And in that feeling, the story began again.